Welcome to the Omni Sports Podcast. Featuring your host, Bobby Labida. There's no cute intro this week. We're just getting directly into our sponsor. And our sponsor for this week is pain. It's misery. It's hopelessness. It's despair. Because going into Sunday, your fantasy basketball team was tied with the other fantasy basketball team 4-4 and a tie for your 9-category league, and you thought maybe, just maybe, you could squeak by. But no, because this is a cruel world, and in this cruel and unjust world, sometimes you pick fantasy players, and sometimes those fantasy players are named after bodies of water, which is appropriate because they're an anchor sending you to a watery grave. Anyways, I've been eliminated from my fantasy league, and it hurts. It hurts a lot. So I'll be okay. All right, I am back and giving you the lineup for this week's episode, and we've got a great one. We've got our storylines of this week, where we're going to be looking at some blocks. We're going to be looking at Luka Doncic's MVP campaign. We're going to be looking at the Timberwolves. There's been a lot going on with the Timberwolves. We're going to look at a stat of the week, and then we're going to look at our stat leaders in specific categories. And lastly, I'm going to do my first ever NBA Power Rankings. So let's begin.
Storylines of the week. 1.
And he's got it with 5, with 4. Lillard on his block. Dinwiddie. It's blocked by Spencer Dinwiddie. Spencer Dinwiddie wins the game for the Lakers.
Edwards can't hit the second. Pacers have a chance. Up ahead, Neesmith. Blocked! Edwards getting up, and good night!
The audio you just heard were 2 amazing blocks that saved the game at the end of regulation, and 2 games that were just a day apart from each other. First, you had Spencer Dinwiddie in his first sort of big Lakers moment, blocking Damian Lillard as he was trying to take the game-winning shot for the Bucks at the end of regulation, and the Lakers ended up winning by 123 to 122. And it's just crazy because it's Dame. You always expect fourth quarter, especially that time, to be Dame time, but no, it was Dinwiddie time, and the Lakers team was so excited. You would think that would be the block of the week because it saved the game at the end, but no. The day before, Anthony Edwards and the Timberwolves against the Pacers, he went up and blocked the ball so hard that as he was flying, his head hit the rim, and one of the most impressive athletic feats I've seen this year. And if you have a chance, please watch both of these blocks. But Anthony Edwards might be one of the defensive play of the year. It was awesome. It was timely. And it was everything you want basketball to be.
2.
Luka Doncic is putting up a streak that you may not be aware of. He has had 6 games in a row with over 30 points and a triple-double, which is the record for that statistic. Russell Westbrook had the record of 5 games. It's crazy the stats we have. The fact we know that's a record. And he also extended his record for the same statistical thing, but for 35 plus points and triple doubles, which he's done for 5 games in a row. And Luka is currently leading the league by a healthy margin in points per game at over 34. And the next one is just under 32. And I think that Luka should be considered more highly in the MVP conversation. Right now, I think he's 3rd or 4th in like the expected outcome, but I think if the Dallas Mavericks had a better seed, a better record, I think that Luka would be getting more conversation around this, because I think people might be a little slow with SGA and the Thunder. They might be a little premature since the Thunder is so young to award him. And also, in some ways, SGA being so consistent hurts him, I think, when it comes to the MVP conversation. And of course, you have Jokic, who's right now the leader of the pack for that. I wonder, see, last year Embiid got the MVP over Jokic, I think, because of voter fatigue. But now I wonder if voters have like buyer's remorse on voting for Embiid over Jokic. And then Jokic, the Nuggets steamrolled in the playoffs on their way to a championship. So I wonder if the conversation will kind of shift towards Jokic because of that. But around this time last year, it really felt like it was going to be Jokic's. And this is about the time the narratives began to switch, partially because Jokic doesn't really care about the narrative. He already had 2 MVPs back to back. It seemed like Embiid's camp was trying to push the narrative a little bit, and so you see that conversation change. And that's the weird thing about MVP and a lot of these awards is like there's no real clear delineation of who should win or not. For example, we're going to talk about a little bit later, but when it comes to Defensive Player of the Year, I think Wembanyama should be considered more, but he isn't because of his team's record. And how much should a team's record really matter in these individual awards? I don't know the answer to that question. It seems like for the voters, it depends. Usually they will, kind of push towards teams that are really, the top 1 or 2 seeds, or a surprise team, like a team you were expecting would be a dumpster fire, and then one player single-handedly carries that team to like the 6th seed. But you really don't see lower seeded teams getting it. But the thing with the Mavericks is the West is really tight from the 5th seed to the 10th seed. So I could see a world where the Mavericks can end up the 5th seed. And then I wonder if Luka gets put in this conversation. He's also averaging the 3rd most assists per game. So Luka is by himself putting up or creating the most points in a single basketball game on average this whole year. And I think he should be more heavily considered. I read internet comments where people say he's selfish as a player and he's a stat hunter, but it's weird because when I watch it, I don't feel that. A lot of the decisions really feel in the flow of the game that he makes. I really don't feel like he's stat hunting. And if carrying your team is stat hunting, then I feel like we're as fans, looking for the wrong things. So sometimes you gotta do that. But the Mavs are looking better since the trade deadline. I think their new pieces are helping them, and Kyrie's back and actually playing good minutes. And I think again, if the Mavs are able to get up a little higher in the seeds, I think I could see a world where Luka would be, the MVP this season.
3.
Oh, the Timberwolves. Things were going so well for you this whole season, and now things are starting to fall apart a little bit. Hopefully it'll be a temporary thing, but we don't know. Karl Anthony Towns was diagnosed with a torn meniscus in his left knee and is going to be out indefinitely. And it sounds like potentially it could be the rest of the season. Any torn ligaments never sounds like a good thing, especially around the knee, because the knee structurally is so important to everything you do in the sport of basketball. Jumping, people forget that shooting, you need good legs under you. You need good form in order for that shooting to happen. And then on Friday's game, Rudy Gobert fouled out. And when he fouled out, he made a money gesture. He got a technical foul. After the game, he made comments basically that since sports betting's got involved in these games, like the refereeing's getting worse, which is a pretty heavy indictment. We hear things like this from players, sometimes, but it was very direct. And normally you don't hear it like from players on the court, maybe after the game. But the fact he was flashing the money sign, and Rudy Gobert ended up being fined $100,000 for all of these actions. And so right now the Timberwolves are really hoping that that Ant will be able to carry the load. Rudy Gobert was out this last game, though it's not a long-term injury. He should be back pretty soon. But I'm worried about the Timberwolves. It's kind of funny. I've been really pro Timberwolves compared to a lot of people this year, because a lot of people, I think, find them boring or will find reasons to dislike players on the team, and then that makes them dislike the team or not believe in the team. But I'm really worried. I think I think Cat, too many animal acronyms. So I think Karl Anthony Towns, he's I felt like inconsistent. Sometimes he's not aggressive when he wants him to be, but, he's such a big presence and, can be a nice offensive threat when needed. So losing him is really a challenge, especially on a Timberwolves team that struggles with offense, right? They are amazing defensively, one of the best teams, in the league defensively, if not the best. And offensively, they're kind of mid. And so losing this important offensive piece will really hurt them. But kind of carrying on what I said about Luka, if Anthony Edwards is able to carry the Timberwolves to a top, if they end up the first seed or something at the end of the season, then maybe Anthony Edwards is more in the MVP conversation. And so I think these last, 15, 16 games that these teams are going to go through is really going to change the narrative. And I think a lot of things are wide open. The West, in terms of seeding, is wide open. All of these awards, I think, are wide open. I don't think any one of them is a lock except for maybe Rookie of the Year. Because Victor is just, he's an alien and truly so. But we'll see for the Timberwolves if all of these new things that have happened will derail their season or if they'll be able to overcome adversity and rise above.
News and notes.
Unfortunately, in tonight's Rockets game, Alpren Sengun fell in an awkward, uncomfortable way. His leg bent, his knee hyperextended, his ankle bent the wrong way, and he had to be taken out of the arena via wheelchair, which didn't look good. We've heard no confirmation yet, though an insider in the NBA tweeted a cryptic tweet of if his season's over, ... and what his season looked like, which has been a great season. So Alpy, hopefully you get better soon, but it looks likely he's played his last minutes this season, which is incredibly unfortunate. Performance of the week. Anthony Marshawn Davis had a 27-point, 25 rebound, 5 assists, 7 steals, his career high, and 3 block game against the Timberwolves on Sunday. And he is the first player to ever have a stat line like this. He's the first player to have a 25-25, 5 steals, let alone 7 steals. And he was 2 blocks away from having a 5x5. And imagine having a 5x5 where there's 2 5x5s with 25 points and 25 assists. 25 rebounds. And this is just a monster performance by Anthony Davis. And honestly, one of my favorite stat lines of the year, minus maybe Victor Wembanyama's his own 5x5, and on the game he had 5 blocks. 10 blocks, which is just crazy. But Anthony Davis has been putting up an amazing season, and I think he should be getting more hype in the Defensive Player of the Year conversation, because he, as much as we talk about LeBron and as great as he is, it's really Anthony Davis that's holding down this team, I think, in a lot of ways, and making it as successful as it is. And the Lakers have been playing a little looser recently and have been looking a little better. It does help when you have a 6-game homestand when you don't have to leave for a while. But man, the stat line by Anthony Davis, whew, crazy.
I'm saying all the stats that I know are right, making good observations. You tell me other stats to compare. Well, whose stats would you want? Let's get statistical.
It's been a while since we've taken a deep dive on different statistical leaders. We used to do this more at the beginning of the season. I felt like, every week I'd talk about different player stats, and then this kind of evolved less from a fantasy podcast, to a sort of a generic what was going on in the NBA podcast. And so we haven't talked about stats, but I think this is a really good time to do it, especially, as we head into the end of the season. We're starting to talk about these awards, and these awards will become a bigger conversation, especially as seeds get decided and stuff like that. So I'm going to look at the top 3 in a bunch of different statistical categories. I think in the past I did the top 5, and that just felt like too much. So my goal is to try to talk quickly and do this sort of as a too long didn't read version, because it can be hard talking about statistics and stats and just listening to them. I think they're exciting, but for a lot of people, it can be like, what's going on? So in points per game, already alluded to earlier today, we have Luka Doncic in first with 34.7 points per game, which I think would be like the third highest since 2000, which is amazing. I think Kobe Bryant and James Harden are the only two to have a higher where they both had 35 in their respective MVP seasons. Then you have Shea at 31.1, and then you have Giannis at 30.8, which I think is incredibly impressive. They're the only three players that are shooting above 30 points per game, and they're really carrying the offensive load for their teams. Then when it comes to rebounds per game, in third, you have the aforementioned Anthony Marshawn Davis at 12.5 per game. And then you have Rudy Gobert at 12.9 per game. And then you have Sabonis still in the lead at 13.5 per game. And Sabonis is playing his butt off this whole year, and I think will likely end up still leading this category at the end. And then assists, you have first still Tyrese Halliburton at 11.3 assists per game. It's gone down a little bit since the beginning of the year when he started really hot. You have Trae Young, who is at 10.8 points per game, but with his injury and potentially being out for a bit, he may fall off this because you have to play a certain amount of games to be considered for these per game statistic leaders. And then in third, you have mentioned before Luka Doncic with 9.8s. With blocks, now I'll go in reverse chronological order for the more drama, but in third you have Brook Lopez, Brolo. At the beginning of the year, he wasn't getting a lot of blocks, but then the Bucks changed their defensive scheme, which allowed Brook to play more in the way that he wants to, and as we can see, his blocks have gone up since then. With just 0.1 above, you have 2.7 Walker Kessler from the Jazz, who's got more minutes. I constantly feel like Walker Kessler is just like this monster that's just being kind of held back, and like one day he's gonna rip out of his chains and we're gonna be like, oh my god, who is this guy? Because I feel like he's very efficient in every minute he plays and is really good really good efficiency, defensive efficiency statistics that you may not see. But in first by a whopping 0.7, which is more significant than second to fifth, you have Victor at 3.4 blocks per game, and he's been averaging like 5 blocks per game the last month, something crazy. I think what Victor is going to do the next few seasons is going to be freaking wild. In steals in 30, you have Donovan Mitchell with 1.8, who he's also would have been fifth in points per game. So Donovan Mitchell is also having a great season, and part of the reason the Cavs are doing so well. And second, you have De'Aaron Fox in steals per game with 1.9. He hasn't been doing so great offensively, but he has picked it up defensively this year. And in first, you still have Shea with 2.1. So Shea is first and second in two different major statistical categories. Then I'm going to go to just the 3-pointers made. I'm not going to go into the percentages just because sometimes those can be skewed by numbers, because often the players that are the most efficient are not the ones who are shooting the most, which makes sense. It's sort of the laws of averages. As you shoot more, you're going to maybe more likely miss. But in 3-pointers made, this is just to show how crazy it is. In third, you have Dante DiVincenzo with 203, which is really, really high for this point of the year. Then in second, you have Luka Doncic with 220, so 18 more. And then with 70 more than Luka Doncic, you have Steph Curry with 290. And once again, he's going to have above 300 threes in a season. I think only him and Clay have done that, and he's done that multiple times. And Steph, he's, as he says, just has more games where there's been some struggles, but he's still great. And I still want to watch him shoot a 3-pointer because it's such a beautiful thing. For the first time ever in Omnisports NBA podcast history, I'm going to be doing a power rankings. If you don't know what a power rankings is, it's a pretty common way that sports media will try to categorize the strength of a team, because a record, while the most important number in basketball, doesn't always tell the whole story. And so you try to say, right now at this moment, if I took a snapshot, who is the best team if I were to place them against each other. So there's a lot of different methodologies for power rankings. Some people like to think about the potential of a team. I'm going to try to do it as a right now in this moment situation. And power rankings are, they're biased, right? Because everyone has their own perspectives. Some people do all 30 teams in the NBA. That's a bit much. So I'm going to do the top 10, which is a pretty common way to do it. I just wanted to mention an honorable mention before I get into my top 10. I was going to have the Miami Heat on this list, but then tonight they decided to lose to the Wizards, and that is an unforgivable sin. I was debating whether or not to put them in the top 10. They were kind of going to be my 9 or my 10, and then they did that. And so, the Heat, you're gone. But my number 10, something else that produces heat, you have the Suns. So the Phoenix Suns, I think now you see the team is playing a bit healthier. I'm worried about their defense in the postseason, but right now we're not in the postseason. I think right now they are playing really good. Kevin Durant has the fourth most points per game. You have Grayson Allen, who is the best 3-point shooter in the league in terms of percentage this year. And Bradley Beal, who's now back. And then Devin Booker, you have 3 major offensive threats. Always for the Suns, their liability has been their defense, though. Looking at some of their underlying defensive metrics, they're actually not as bad as I thought they would be when I was looking at them. But the Suns right now have a 2.6 point differential on the season compared to other teams, which puts them in 11th. So this feels like kind of a natural inclination of that. I will be using a lot, like the 2 stats I'll be most relying on for some of these rankings is point differential for the season, but then I'm also going to be looking, how they've done in whichever team has done in their last, bit of games. And the Suns, they are 5-5, which is lower on this list. But I think that there's a good chance that they can end up doing very, very well. And then number 9, you have what could be considered, I don't think it's a hot take, but I don't think this team ever comes up in conversations. You have the Orlando Magic. I think that they are young, they are hungry, they have a really solid defense. It's one of the best defenses in the leagues, and I think they have a lot of talent. And I think they're being coached well, and they're doing well in their last 10. They're 7-3, and so I think that they have a lot of potential, and I think that they have a lot of ability to grow as a squad. And so I think that the Orlando Magic, I think that in a 7-game series, I don't know if they get swept by any team, just because I think they also match up well against a lot of teams because of their size. I just want to note that the Knicks, who have a better record than the Magic, are not on my list as currently, and that mostly has to do with injury, because Julius Randle's not here. I think the Knicks are pretty sorely lacking in depth currently, so it's not an indictment on what I think the Knicks will do long term, but that's why they're not on my list. And number 8, we're staying in the East. We have the Cleveland Cavaliers, who are 5-5 in their last 10, which is not great. However, the Cavs have a pretty solid 4.5 point differential on the season, and they are, which puts them in 6th for the season. I think the Cavs are a bit up and down. Last season, when they made the playoffs, they underperformed. However, they now have a bit of experience, and Donovan Mitchell is really good, and I think would be, if people were paying attention, top 10 in MVP voting this year at minimum, probably even higher, maybe 6th or 7th, or even higher than that. I could see a world where you could get 5th. And I think that the Cavs they're young, they have a lot of talent, they have a lot of bigs. Sometimes I feel like they're more than the sum of their parts, and sometimes I feel the opposite. Also, as someone who rode the Max Strus fantasy experience, he can get very hot or cold. So I say sometimes the Cavs can get streaky. Next, in continuing our power rankings, we're going to be going to the West. In number 7, we have the Timberwolves. I would probably have them higher if it weren't for the fact that Karl Anthony Towns is now hurt, and I think it's going to take some time for the team to adjust without him. They have the 3rd best point differential on the season, so it kind of sucks to have them this low. I think some people might say they should be out of the top 10 because of Cat not being there, but I think that they have shown that they're a good enough team that shouldn't be a consideration. And I think that some of these other teams, that are below, they still would struggle with the Rudy Gobert defense and an Ant-led offense. And you still have Naz Reid, Connolly. You still have some nice pieces there, and some nice role players. In sixth, we have going back to the East, and then we're not going to come back to the East for a while. You have the Milwaukee Bucks, who are 7-3 in their last 10. They've picked it up the last bit of games, though they did have a rough patch once Doc took over. I think that the Bucks are the classic, can beat any team and lose to any team. They have a lot of great players. It just feels like something's off when I watch the Bucks. I can't quite verbalize it, and it's been this way all year, so this is not just a Doc thing. It's just like, it feels like there's not a perfect meshing of styles with Dame and Giannis, and that's not to say that they're hurting each other. It just kind of feels like there isn't this seamless flow that you kind of expect with the Bucks. I think that the Bucks were always a very very clean team, and that they always were they always played well and fought kind of in this one brain, and it feels like there's more disconnect this year. But you have Giannis, who's an MVP, and you have Dame, who can play like an MVP any night. But I'm still worried about them being outcoached in particular situations. I thought that Darvin Ham outcoached the Bucks in the game this week, which is, I'm sorry to bury the guy. It's not a sentence I've said a lot this season. Now we're heading back to the West for a little bit. And in fifth, which I think this is probably, of all my power ranking numbers, the spiciest of takes. So get your milk ready, or if you're lactose intolerant, get your almond milk ready. And if you hate almonds, get your water ready. And if you hate water, then stop listening, because you should go drink some water. You're probably dehydrated. You have a headache. This is why you're being mean to your friends. Stop being mean to your friends and drink some water. But in fifth, we have the Pelicans. I think the Pelicans are just kind of this really solid all-around team. They have a lot of good pieces. Brandon Ingram is a really good player. Zion, of course, is really good. I think they have really good defensive schemes. I think CJ McConnell can get hot. You have Herb Jones, who's playing good defense. And so I think the Pelicans are also big, so I think they can match up against a lot of teams, and they can play big or they can play small, which I think is really important. And I think, I think we, because of the Warriors, have kind of overcorrected on playing big or playing small. It seems like still historically you need to play big, and the Pelicans can at least do that. And they made it to, I know it's not probably for a lot of people a big deal. They made it to the semifinals of the in-season tournament, and it shows that when they're focused, they can potentially beat a lot of teams. And I think that they're a potential dark horse. I don't see them getting out of the West because of teams I'm going to talk about in the future, but I think that they are a better team that people realize. In fourth, I have the Clippers. I think the Clippers, when things are going right, are maybe the scariest team. Just because when everything's clicking offensively, I think Harden, Kawhi, and Paul George can just do so many interesting things. And Kawhi Leonard is just a virtuoso at being at the right place at the right time. Harden's really good at running the offense from the point. And so, and Russell Westbrook, when he wants to, can be a really great energy off the bench. And most of the time, I think he is. And so I think the Clippers are really scary. They have one of the best, better point differentials on the season at fifth. And considering how they started the season, they probably, over the last course of the season are fourth. Forgot to mention the Pelicans, who I talked about, and the fourth best point differential across the whole season, which I don't think people would realize. In third, I have the Oklahoma City Thunder, which have the second best point differential at 7.5. And 7.5 is great historically. That's really up there. That's a really high successful team. I think the Thunder, they have a lot of depth. I think the Thunder, if I had to pick a team that I think would have the best record over the next 5 years, I would probably pick the Thunder, just because they have so much draft capital from bad teams. So they're still going to get really good draft picks this year, even though that they're going to be a really high seed. I think the concern with the Thunder is kind of what everyone's been saying, is that they're so young. And it feels like, even though it doesn't have to be the case, but it feels like you kind of got to earn your stripes, right? You have to go through this postseason, and you gotta take a tough loss. And this team didn't even make it to the postseason last year. I mean, they made it to the play-in, but they didn't make it into a 7-game series. And I think that there's this tendency to just write them off because of that. And I want to say, no, don't do that. But at the same time, history shows that this is not a team that would likely win the championship just because they are so young and they haven't had that experience. Very rarely does a team go from, we've never made the playoffs, to we are now champions. So I think if they make it for the Thunder, maybe more than any other team in the playoffs, I think matchups will really dictate how far they go. And second, you have my power rankings, the Boston Celtics, which would probably a majority of the season be my number one. The Boston Celtics have a 10.9 plus minus rating or differential on the season, which I think puts them at 6 all time, right ahead of the 1995-1996 Chicago Bulls. So we're talking about rarefied air, how good the Celtics are playing. On top of that, I found a statistic today that the Celtics have the easiest schedule going forward, which breaks my little Lakers heart. But and the Celtics have an 8-game lead in the Eastern Conference for the first seed. So I think the Celtics are just going to coast right now. I think that's part of the reason. One of the reasons that they're a little lower for me is that they have played well their last time, but it feels like that there's been more of these sloppy kind of moments, that have been happening in the games that the Celtics have been playing. And I don't blame them. I mean, the Nuggets did it this last year and, they won a championship. But the Celtics they're so good. I just worry about their clutch gene, and I hate when people bring up playing in the clutch, because I think that's kind of a dumb thing. And now I'm bringing it up, but I feel like the Celtics, they have the best record against Eastern Conference teams. From Eastern Conference teams, they have the best record against the West, so they are a threat. But also, in overtime, they have a losing record, right? And so I think that I'm worried about the Celtics sometimes in high leverage, high pressure situations, especially because the Celtics can be a team that gets very 3 happy. They like to shoot the 3 ball. And I think that tendency when you're anxious gets worse. And if you're anxious, it's probably because you're not making threes. And so then all of a sudden possessions get too fast and you get sped up, and then they're just jacking up shots. And, the 2017 Houston Rockets were a team that just shot a bunch of threes, and they very famously missed 27 threes in a row in Game 7 against the Warriors that season. And had they not, the Warriors, they would have beaten the Warriors, and that would have been a very different storyline that year. But they missed 27 threes in a row, which honestly is crazy, because I think even if you gave me a basketball after 23 shots from 3, I would make 1 at least. But also I'm not being defended by actual professionals, and it's not a high leverage game. But still, the whole point is that you have higher variability when you are shooting the 3, and so I worry about the Celtics' tendency for that. But your number 1 seed is, for me, in power rankings, is the Denver Nuggets. And the reason for this is partially the Nuggets played the Celtics this weekend, which I think was one of the games of the year, one of the best games so far this year. And the Nuggets won, and they did it in a team effort. Jokic was great. And I think, for me, all the chips are on the line, right? I trust the Nuggets. There's no reason for me to not think they could do it, because they've proven they can do it, because they did it last year. And I think they can turn it on. I think the Nuggets still have a really good chance to get the 1 seed in the West, and I think that will be really helpful, especially because playing in the Mile High City is often seen as one of the biggest home field advantages in all of sports. So if the Nuggets get home field advantage, all of a sudden all these teams now have to travel to Denver for 4 games and play an elevation they may not be used to. And even though these are amazing athletes, it can still affect them. I've heard stories of athletes talking about how the wind, like you adapt pretty quick, but like the first quarter of the game, you're just like, why am I so exhausted? Just because you're not getting the same amount of oxygen in your blood. But I think the Nuggets are still the best team. They beat the Celtics this week, who I think the whole year have been the best team. And so that's part of the reason that I have the Nuggets ahead of the Celtics, is it's like, if I'm splitting hairs between the two and they just played each other and one of the teams won, I'm going to pick that. Some people really subscribe to that philosophy in power rankings and some people really don't, but I'm subscribing to it now, just I think for logical consistency, because that's the most recent game that these teams have played against each other. So those are my power rankings for the end of the season, and we'll see how these power rankings translates to schedule and results for the end of the NBA season. Thank you so much for joining me this week, even though this week is a painful week, because again, it's brought to you by pain, despair, and all the feelings that you have in your fantasy leagues. But as much as I do joke, fantasy sports, they're great. An opportunity to connect with friends. And what's really cool in our fantasy league, our 4 finalists are 3 women and a gay man. And so I think that's really cool that there's an opportunity for inclusion and diversity in sports that I think sometimes are lacking. So, who would have thought, a Filipino woman from Palmdale, an Indian woman from Thousand Oaks, a Southern white woman from Kentucky, and a gay Jewish man from Los Angeles would all end up in the same fantasy league and be finalists, even though they all broke my heart because they beat me and I'm the commissioner, but it's okay. But without further ado, thank you all for listening to another week of the Omni Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Labita, trying to get you caught up on the week's news in a easy to digest sort of way, so that you don't have to be one of those people who listens to 27 hours of podcasts a week like me, right? You could just listen to the one podcast and get everything done. Please, if you're able to, leave us a review, rate us. It helps us in the algorithm. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment. Tell me what was wrong with my power rankings or what was right with my power rankings. And most importantly, please join our Discord, where soon we're going to have information about a March Madness bracket that I think will be a lot of fun, and I want to get as many people involved as possible. But thank you all, and I'll see you again next week.